Welcome to this episode of the Manager Track podcast. Today we're going to talk about biohacking leadership and how to change small behaviors in order to increase your executive presence and your impact. My guest on today's show is Dr. Scott Hutcheson, a biosocial scientist, a senior lecturer at Purdue University, a TED speaker, and a best-selling author. With over 30 years of experience advising organizations from the White House to Fortune 400 companies, Scott has worked with more than 4,000 leaders across 147 countries. Now, in his book, Biohacking Leadership, he challenges that leadership is about personality. He's making the argument that instead, it's biology that drives leadership impact. By applying neuroscience, biomechanics, and behavioral science, Scott shows leaders how to intentionally shape their presence, their decision-making, and their influence to elevate both their own performance and the performance of those around them. So clearly you're in for a treat, as I'm going to bring someone in with a vast amount of experience working with leaders directly and helping them elevate their presence and their leadership overall. Now, we're going to talk about his frameworks and his suggestions and what are actually the little behavioral habits to tweak in order to increase or enhance how you're being perceived by others. We're also going to talk about his decision-making approach and how he advises leaders to be authentic, yet to experiment with behavioral tweaks in order to increase their effectiveness while still coming across as and feeling authentic as a leader. This is a concise conversation, but full of insights and wisdom directly from Scott. I'm excited to share this, and I truly enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you will too. Let's dive in. Here are the two questions this podcast answers. One, how do you successfully transition into your first official leadership role? And two, how do you keep climbing that leadership ladder and continuously get promoted, although the competition and the expectations get bigger? This show, the Manager Track podcast, will provide the answers. I'm your host, Ramona Shaw. I'm on a mission to create workplaces where work is seen as a source of contribution, connection, and personal fulfillment. And this transition starts with developing a new generation of leaders who know how to lead so everyone wins and grows. In the show, you'll learn how to think, communicate, and act as a confident and competent leader you know you can be. Scott, welcome to the Manager Track podcast. I am really excited to have this conversation with you. This is an angle that we don't often talk about, and I'm looking forward to all the wisdom that you're going to share with our audience today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Speaking of this being a bit of a unique angle on leadership, how did you get into the sort of the intersection between leadership and biohacking and neuroscience and so forth?
Yeah, so about 5 years ago, I was asked to go into an employer in California who wanted training done in executive presence. And I said, okay, I think I can do that. But I had never been really thrilled with the idea of executive presence. It hadn't been very well, I think, researched. So there wasn't a lot of evidence-based frameworks for executive presence. It was kind of those, you know it if you see it, probably too much of an emphasis on natural charisma. Mm-hmm. So I really started to kind of dig into literally executive presence. And, executive, of course, it describes an office or a high level within an organization. But I found out that it actually came from the executive functions of the brain. And that's why we kind of co-opted that term for the highest level of leadership, because we want our leaders to be able to think with the full force of their executive functions, to plan and to be strategic and to problem solve and have cognitive flexibility. But the problem is no one can see how you think. So we have our presence. Right. So wanted to understand what were the signals that a leader could send to demonstrate that they have the capacity to lead. And it turned out that those signals are really kind of biological in nature. We sense these signals from other people. We kind of feel them first, right? We're inspired or we get the ick. Right? And then our body sends a signal to our brain. Our brain interprets that, says, oh, I know this feeling. I feel inspired, or I feel discouraged, right? I feel engaged, or I feel disengaged. And then our behavior kind of follows. So I was fascinated by this kind of biological underpinning of this idea of leadership.
What is something that you learned in this process that surprised you?
I learned that small tweaks to behavior could have significant impact. And that's actually where I kind of settled on this idea of biohacking. So, in a completely different part of my life, about that same time, 5 years ago, I got a diabetes diagnosis. I knew it was probably a matter of when rather than if. It ran in the family. A1C was creeping up every time I would have my physical. And I finally crossed that threshold. And so I really wanted to understand how my behavior impacted my blood sugar and inflammation levels and all that. So I never really considered myself a biohacker, but I was doing many of the things that traditional biohackers do. I got a continuous glucose monitor. I really monitored my diagnostics and my blood panels, and then I was experimenting with not only how I eat. Everybody knows that that impacts your blood sugar, but exercise, quality of sleep, how I was managing stress. And I began to see that small tweaks to my behavior, I had real-time data that it was lowering my blood sugar. And so I kind of put those two things together.
Hmm.
Biohacking, there's a lot of junk science out there, but there's some good science too. And I
Hmm.
thought, well, if leadership is behavioral and behavior is biological, then biology can be understood and manipulated. So why not biohacking leadership?
So, to build on that, if it's small behaviors that lead to change or lead to a different impression and perception of executive presence, then what would you say are sort of the most unknown little tweaks that yield a positive outcome that most of us are not aware of?
Yeah, so when we wanted to, and by we, I'm talking about some of my graduate students and I, so I'm a professor at Purdue University. We wanted to understand, all right, what is the kind of the minimally viable set of data that others perceive and say, yeah, I think that person has leadership potential, or I'm not sure that they do. And we make those um, categorizations quite quickly. There's really interesting studies around how you decide who you're going to vote for.
Hmm.
And there's one study that looked at like 2-second flashes of the faces of candidates is very predictive of which one will win the election. We
Hmm.
see similar research around doctor-patient interactions. One research project looked at silent footage, just watching a doctor interact with a patient, and they could predict pretty accurately which doctors might be sued for malpractice and which won't,
Hmm.
simply by these nonverbal, the tilt of a head, the genuine warm smile, proximity to the other person, the slight lean in,
Hmm.
even without getting into the words that they say. Remember, these were all silent. So there are so many small tweaks. There's really interesting research on if I come onto this call with an open face, just a slight smile, eyebrows arched just the tiniest bit, that's going to send a very different signal than if I walked around like this, which is actually my normal face. I'm usually deep in thought and my brow is furrowed. So imagine showing up like that instead of with an open face. So we have tiny tweaks that we've identified, everything from that sort of micro expression to consistently showing up on time, to narrating your thinking for those that you lead to say, you know what, here's how I arrived at that decision. And you kind of show them how you think. So we
Hmm.
have a nice core set of about 18 of these that some seem really, really tiny and really, really subtle, and people are probably only going to be impacted on a subconscious level. Others are quite more visible.
Okay, you just dropped a couple of examples. One that being on time, and the second one was about the narrating of the decision-making process, which I love. What are a few others? And I'm actually, since we're doing this virtual too, I'm going to start there. On a camera or in a virtual conference and Teams or Zooms or whatever companies are using, what are some of the things that you constantly see missed opportunities and such low-hanging fruit that make a big impact?
Yeah, well, let me address your first question first. What are some of the others? So the 18 actually cluster together into three what I call kind of biodynamic channels. And six of them align with warmth,
Hmm.
six of them align with competence, and 6 of them align with gravitas. And I define gravitas a bit differently because I think Isaac Newton kind of screwed it up for us. So
Hmm.
let me unpack that one just a little bit. So when he co-opted the word gravitas, which was first used to describe a person, when he used it to describe gravity, we kind of overemphasize weightiness and seriousness when we applied it to people. But I love the planetary definition. Our Earth just has one moon, but we pulled it into our orbit and channeled its inertia to orbit around us. So my definition of gravitas is the ability to draw people together to create shared value. So we connect with warmth. We demonstrate that we have something to contribute with our competence, our area of expertise, our resources that we're willing to share. And then if we say, hey, together we can do something of shared value, those are the 3 channels that demonstrate that someone is capable of leading at a high level. So again, underneath each of those, there are these kind of 6 biometrics, I call them, that when we check the box on each of these, we're increasingly convinced that this person could be a good leader. And then when we see them consistently behave in that way, we're not only convinced that they might be, we are convinced that they will be. So let me kind of rattle off the 6 under warmth since we start there. So listens well to others. Listens truly in the moment, is present, connects with people on a personal level. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to be all up in people's business if that's kind of not your style, but just kind of recognizing that this is a whole person on the other side of this relationship and recognizing their humanity. Validates others, simply stating out loud what you appreciate about them. Is other oriented in their conversation or their work focus. So if we're having a conversation and say, I need you to do this for me, well, that's not very other oriented, right?
Hmm.
Again, I might share why it might be good for both of us.
Hmm.
I might turn it around and say, what do you need from me in order to help you accomplish that task that I've asked you to do? So that's being other oriented. And then it is approachable and relatable. And then third is simply thoughtful, is simply thoughtful. So those are the 6 underneath warmth. And of course, we've got 6 under competence. We've got 6 under gravitas.
It's so interesting how you refer to this like I statements because we're so occupied day in and day out with what we need to do or what our goals are that we sometimes forget to make that little shift in how we communicate. One of those pet peeves that I have is when people say, I want you to, even just like, I want you to grab a piece of paper and a pen.
Right.
Like immediately, like,
Like, who are you to tell me what to do?
no, I don't know where that's coming from, my stubbornness. But I totally understand what they actually mean by that, and I can get over the message in itself. But there are different ways to say that where it's just you centric, right? How that would a simple statement like this would benefit the other person. And at work, I think that makes a huge difference in how we come across.
Yeah.
So it's small shifts that you just laid out in language, but then you also say things such as listen better. And I think if I just remember conversations from our audience and leaders we work with, this like listens actively or listen is present. Sometimes we think we're listening, but we're actually not demonstrating that.
Right. That's true. We look for cues that other people are listening to us. I
Mhm.
remember back in COVID when we had come back onto campus, but everyone was masked, and we had to have classes in rooms 6 times the size that we otherwise would need because everyone had to be 6 feet apart.
Mhm.
So it was a large class anyway, but 100 students in an auditorium that seats like 600. Seriously, all I could see was this. It was winter, so everyone was in a hoodie and a coat. And I remember one person, and I can see where she sat right up there. She was just giving me the nod, and her eyes were so bright. It was the only feedback I was getting. And man, oh man, it fueled me in a way that I otherwise might not have been able to make it through those lectures. I kind of wondered, is she doing it just for me? I kind of thought she probably was. I think she thought he probably needs this.
Mhm.
But even so, like what a gift, right? What a gift. And I guarantee you it spiked my oxytocin, it spiked my dopamine. just a simple set of nonverbals to know that at least one of those 100 students was tracking and listening and getting something out of it.
So for someone who says like, okay, I like this idea of biohacking and really thinking about that presence and how we project ourselves, the confidence and the competence and that approachability that we send out, and then through that, how we influence and impact other people. Do I grasp this correctly that you say, hey, think about these six different pillars under each of those three categories, and then look at what are sort of small signals that you're sending or that you're not sending that demonstrate each of them?
Yes, yes, that's exactly right. In fact, we've also developed a psychometric assessment that's been statistically validated, where someone can assess themselves, like how well do I think I send each of these 18 signals? But then they can also get a feedback assessment from others. Just,
Mm-hmm.
they can invite five people below them, peers or above them, to give feedback. And so you can get data to
Mm-hmm.
compare how you think you're sending signals versus how other people are sending signals.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've demonstrated that these are developmental. You can do a better job of sending these signals. So in some of our research, we would have people do this assessment originally to get a baseline,
Mm-hmm.
and then they would either participate in one of my courses at the university or one of the professional development courses I do, and then we'd follow up with an additional feedback assessment. Find that the improvement and consistently signaling these signals goes up 30 to 40%.
Mm-hmm.
Those are sustained over time when we kind of learn new habits of how we interact with others.
How do we make sure that then this doesn't turn into us being perceived as robotic or inauthentic? And I'm sure that you get that question a lot.
Yeah. So my advice to people is to be you, but be willing to kind of dial up or dial down you by no more than about 20%.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not a very emotive kind of person. Warmth for me was kind of the last of those two to sort of develop.
I would have never guessed. So you did that well.
Thank you, because I hear that all the time. People who have met me over the last 5 or 6 years would say, "Oh, Scott's a pretty warm individual." And in my case, I felt things inside, but I just didn't emote externally.
Mm-hmm.
But I decided, I'm going to try that. And again, little tweaks,
Mm-hmm.
warm up that face just a little bit, smile at a student or a coworker in a way I might smile with a friend, asking about their day. I remember kind of one of my go-to baristas at the coffee shop where I stop at, something about she was probably my age, two or three times the age of most of the 20-something baristas. I always kind of wondered what her story was. Was this a retirement gig or whatever? But my day was always better when she waited on me. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought, you know what? I'm going to tell her that my day is always better when she waits on me. And that is not something I would typically do. I mean, I'm not going to be rude to her, but I just put myself out there and told her. And her face lit up and made me smile even more broadly. And now she's still a barista at that coffee shop. We have this nice little relationship that we're glad to see one another. So I kind of faked it the first time, but then it felt and it continues to feel genuine.
Now, in our work or my work in coaching and training programs, including executive presence, one of the core ideas and principles that we operate with is that the way that you think also changes the way that you feel and then changes the way that you act. And in order to create sustainable habit change, you don't just want to change a behavior, you really also want to change the way that you think.
Yeah,
And so sometimes, like coaches, right, the question is a bit of like where on which side of that chain
right.
do you start? Do you start with the thoughts or do you start with the behaviors? Or, in my opinion, you're going to do both at the same time. You're looking at behavioral change, but you're also looking at how do I need to change my mindset or the way that I think about something. So I'm curious what your response to that is, and if you agree, how you would combine the two to make sure that people reading the book or going through these different behavioral changes that also the way that they see themselves as leaders then changes.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually addressed that in the book on a chapter called Biomechanics.
Hmm.
And that came from a pretty interesting place. So long before I did this kind of work, as an undergrad, I studied theater and I directed plays and thought that's what I would do.
Hmm.
So I learned different schools of acting. Of course, everyone has probably heard of Stanislavski's The Method, Marlon Brando, James Dean. Oh, you just feel this emotion for real inside and it'll just spill out of you. Well, there was a Russian guy who was a contemporary of him named Meyerhold. Well, he talked about the biomechanics of theater to say, no, no, you get it right on the inside and then it'll come in. You get it right on the outside and then it'll come inside.
Hmm.
And so one of the ways I applied that when I was directing a play is I would ask people, what kind of shoes would your character wear? Long before we had any discussions about other costuming choices. And they would say, oh, well, they wear flip-flops because they're a surfer, or, they'd wear wingtips because they're a business person, or they wear stilettos, or, they'd wear sneakers. Right? Start wearing those in rehearsal. And
Hmm.
anyone who has more than one pair of shoes know that you feel differently depending on what kind of shoes you have on. So I really think it's both. There are things that we can do externally, behaviorally, that impact our brains and the way in which we think. But then there are ways in which we think that automatically sort of spill out in our behavior. So I think it is this dance of tweaking the things you're doing on the inside and the things that you're doing on the outside to align them better so that your way of thinking kind of matches the way in which you're showing up for others.
One of the things that you talk about in the book, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, is decision making. And I always find that is sort of that slogan, good leaders decide about their decision making or their decision making process. I
Mhm.
botched that quote or that that statement. But the point is we can't rely on our gut instincts only or our behaviors in the decision making process. And the further up that we go and the more responsibilities that we have, the more important it becomes to really evaluate and think through the way that we make decisions. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the biohacking approach to making better decisions as leaders.
So, one of the things that we're trying to accomplish by using this idea of three biodynamic channels is that they really are channels. So, think of them as three channels on a mixing board. You can dial them up or you can dial them down. So one of the things we do in our classrooms and our training is look at different scenarios in which one might need to be dialed up and you lead with that one, or another might be dialed down to make room for other signals in the environment. So competence is one of those. So one of the things I do with leaders is try to help them think through, all right, I'm facing a big decision. Is the issue or the problem or the opportunity about which I need to make a decision, is it merely complicated and it needs, a specialized area of expertise, or is it complex, meaning that it's going to require kind of lots of input and lots of expertise from different perspectives. And I need to kind of use my gravitas to bring people together to share that expertise. And then I make an informed decision based on that expertise. So that might be a spot where you kind of dial down your own competence to make room for other people's competence. There's an interesting term in the literature called equity of voice. In other words, that the inputs are relatively even in the work that we're doing together to solve a problem. So when something is highly complex, you really need equity of voice. If it's complex, there's really, no one area of expertise that's going to get you where you need to go. So how can a leader kind of dial down their expertise to allow for others to share their expertise and leverage that gravitas to bring those people together and to design something with shared value. And by the way, you can't do that unless you connect with them by warmth. So warmth might be high, competence might be high, but I dial down competence just a little bit. So I'm not taking up all the air in the room.
I like how you distinguish between the complicated and the complex. And complicated, actually, sort of to generalize it, may require higher competence
Yeah,
versus the complex requires sort of lower competence on our own in order to and increase warmth in order to bring in more people
right.
look at things from different perspectives.
Yes.
I almost final question here is around the cultural differences and how these signals are interpreted. And I think one of the reasons why executive presence can be so elusive and hard to capture or study is because what executive presence means in the Western world, or let's say North America, or even in Europe, there are differences. And then we compare that to countries in Asia, we see vast differences. So, what are the differences that you've noticed, and how do you approach that and address it with leaders?
Yeah, I think the biology is the same.
Hmm.
Uh, that the relationship between leader and follower and teammates is biological in its, at its core, but expressions might vary by culture. So we have a very international student body at Purdue University, one of the highest percentage of international students. So we have this great little microcosm of people from all over the world. And part of what we get to do is have conversations and understand some of those differences. And then when we're training students to go out there, we have some really good kind of cultural tools to say, all right, have you never gone out to dinner with a group of Japanese colleagues? Well, here's some things that you might need to think about differently. Even the way for Asian colleagues, how you present a business card might be different than the way you present a business card to a European colleague or to someone here in the US. So understanding that there are differences, and not only culturally, but helping us understand, I think that neurodiversity is important as well. I mean, something as simple as eye contact can be difficult for other people. So recognize that if I'm not sensing eye contact, that might not mean that that person is deceptive or shy. There might be something else going on there, and I need to be a bit more forgiving. And when I am the sender of eye contact, I understand that I need to kind of watch what's going on around me and fit within the cultural norms. But part of that is being really, really aware and experimenting. Right? If you do something that doesn't quite land, ask a question, right? Find a confidant that understands that culture. So we respond the same no matter who we are or where we're from biologically on the inside, but the signals might need to be stronger or weaker or altered in some way.
I think that speaks directly to what we've talked about earlier with ideally we look at this from the two sides of behavioral change, but also changing the way we think. Because when it comes to the cultural differences, and you called out like you have to be conscious, you have to be aware, and you have to be curious.
Mhm.
And so when we think, oh, I got this figured out, or I know how to light up a room or own a room, or I know how to present myself with confidence in a meeting, what we may think projects confidence in a meeting with people from different demographics may not actually land well at all, may actually make us seem the opposite of confident. And at that point, I think if we go back and we think about the mindset component, that will make the difference as to am I then the one who's going to put myself out there differently and adapt to what I'm observing in others and how they respond? Am I going to do one of those experiments that you said or ask a question as well?
Yeah, I mean, we all have multiple ways in which we show up. I show up slightly differently with my family than with my friends that I've known for 40 years, and a bit differently with colleagues, and a bit differently with undergraduate students versus graduate students. So we make these adjustments and figure out how to make our way in the world by, again, not being inauthentic, but learning, oh, I need to dial this up or dial this down, stretch myself just a little bit, or suppress some urge to always be sarcastic, right? And recognize that that probably that rubs people the wrong way. So I need to back off on that a little bit. So we know how to do this in other contexts. And I think one of the pieces of advice that I give leaders, especially emerging leaders, is it's experimentation. You get to try things. I get to try on this way of showing up, motivating you, understanding what it's like to live in your shoes. And when I find something that works, I keep doing that until I have evidence that it's not working in a different context. And when I find that something is just not landing, then I better try another approach.
Okay, now final question.
Okay.
If and I'm sure not only have you worked with so many leaders across many, many different countries and companies, But now, since you wrote the book, I'm sure you have a sort of that laser focus on how people come across. If you had to give our audience three things and say, like, these are the most typical things that you could shift and it would make a big impact, where do you suggest they start?
Yeah, I'd go back to earlier part of our conversation. So, we talked about warmth, competence, and gravitas. That's actually a really good sequence to use in our interactions with others. And you really made a good point about do I start with I, do I start with you? So if I'm going to signal warmth first, that should be you focused, right? Our first part of our conversation, I should be focusing on you, figuring out how you are, what you need right now. And then if it comes time for me to share my competence, that's when I can move into some I statements. Here's how I've been thinking about that, or I had this experience that might be relevant here. So you start with the other, you,
Mhm.
and then we move to I, and then with gravitas, we end with us. Here's how we are going to move together forward, right? Move forward together. Even if it's something you're taking on to let you know you're not alone, I'm here to support you. We're going to meet together every other Friday and I'm going to check in. You can email me anytime, right? But you're not in this alone. We're going to work on this together. So start with you and contribute with I, and then end it with the we.
Good. I like that. Are there any other quick tips before we wrap?
Yeah, again, I think experiment, right? Experiment. We all figured out how to be a friend, in kindergarten and first grade. We figured
Mhm.
out how to be a good date when we began going out on dates as teenagers or young adults. We figure out how to be a good leader by trying stuff and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't and making adjustments. So experiment, gather
Yeah,
data,
no.
make some change.
I know there's so much more in your book and in your work. So we're going to link to that in the show notes. And I so recommend people to think about, including myself, like what are the habits that we don't even notice, the things that we do that we think are fine or not a big deal. And only when we see how they're being perceived by others, we really get to into the question of whether it's fine or whether it's useful or not. It's not our interpretation and that matters. It's really ultimately sort of the consensus of the people that we surround ourselves with, be it at work or in our personal lives. Thank you for coming on, Scott, and sharing about this idea of biohacking and your story of how you even came up with the concept. As I said, I think you're really onto something, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Ramona.
If you enjoyed this episode, then check out two other awesome resources to help you become a leader people love to work with. This includes a free masterclass on how to successfully lead as a new manager. Check it out at arcova.org/masterclass. The second resource is my best-selling book, The Confident and Competent New Manager: How to Quickly Rise to Success in Your First Leadership Role. Check it out at arcova.org/books or head on over to Amazon and grab your copy there. You can find all those links in the show notes down below.